Hello and welcome back to the annual Electoral Integrity Project Conference. This is panel 3. The panel is looking at election campaigns and political competition. So we have 2 papers in this panel. We'll begin to start with a focus particularly looking at Mexico and the challenges to electoral processes there, and progress from there to look at some of the challenges involved in running elections and democracy surviving during times of a pandemic. So without further ado, we'd like to hand over to our first speaker, and Irma, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. My name is Irma Mendez. I'm a professor at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Mexico, and my co-author, she isn't here, but she is finishing her PhD. Next, please. This is a paper about electoral malpractices, and this is a work in progress. So what I will show you is an under-argument and some of the evidence we have been gathering, and we are still doing the analysis. Next one, please. Our point of departure is the decline, the erosion of democracy, and the decline of the quality of elections in Mexico, which is the country we are analyzing. Despite electoral reforms in the last couple of years, especially in the electoral malpractice we are dealing with, which is the intervention of public officials, these and the use of public resources have been increasing since 2007, despite bans. And this problem is particularly serious when it involves local executives, since their political activism, their intervention, make an intimidation of voters and bias the competition. We show in the paper, and we use 4 different indicators to measure the trend of the decline of the quality of elections and the democracy. We explain why this is a problem. Next one, please. Okay, the literature we are using and dealing with is obviously the Electoral Integrity Manual, the Manual of Manipulation by Andreas Schedler, and the consensus about the short-term and long-term factors that are important to explain electoral malpractices. And in this case, we use Sarah Birch, that she mentions that losing legitimacy is the most significant impediment or deterrent to electoral manipulation. But we also take apart from this, and we use Simster, who argues that electoral malpractices are used not only to win, but also to show a strength and to win majorities or super majorities. He mentioned here that cheaters do not stop at winning, not because they miscalculate, but because their goal is something more than simply reaching the threshold of victory. So in a sense, we take this because we think that this is important in the case we are dealing with, which is Mexico. Next one, please. So the purpose of this paper is to analyze the evolution of integrity and electoral malpractices and identify the factors, institutional and political factors, that are associated with the deterioration of this use in the country cases, and we are analyzing Mexico. We analyze specifically the illegal intervention of local executives, what we call governors, in elections in the 2006 to 2024 period. Next one. The research question: what explains electoral manipulation, in our case in Mexico, and to what extent this illegal activism by public officials is linked to political factors, especially political competition, and institutional factors such as legal sanctions. Next one, please. The main argument, we assume that elections are manipulated not only to obtain victories, but also to consolidate power, minimizing the opposition, and achieving majorities or even super majorities. And in Mexico, the variation of the argument is that the undue intervention of public officials are the response of the strength of formal legal sanctions, but also the political competition, using as an indicator the share of seats for governing party to reach the majority. Next one, please. So, in a sense, the dependent variable is the judicial complaints regarding undue intervention by public officials. We use these because, as you know, measuring electoral malpractices is quite a challenge. It is very difficult to measure them because of its nature. I mean, most of incumbents and political actors try to hide electoral malpractices, electoral manipulation, forms of electoral manipulation. So that's why it is quite difficult. So what we decided is to use the judicial complaints. We have in Mexico, we have the electoral system has two main bodies, electoral bodies. One, which is the administrative INE, what we call the National Electoral Institution, and this one organizes elections. And we have another one, which is a court. This is a tribunal, the Electoral Tribunal, which deals with complaints made by citizens, parties, political actors, in general. So we decided to take these as an indicator of electoral manipulation. In the case we are dealing with intervention by public officials, and we have two independent variables of interest. The first one, the political competition, measured by the share of seats, as I mentioned, for governing party to reach majority. And the second independent variable of interest is the strength, or what we call the strength of legal sanctions for violating the principle of impartiality by public officials. Next, please. Okay. What we did to gather the information is that we asked directly the Electoral Tribunal to give us the database of all electoral malpractices, all complaints dealing with electoral malpractices in the period of between 2006 and 2024. And we asked them to give these complaints with 9 topics, you will see. So the general trend is this. So as you can see, this is like the first big panorama of how the complaints about electoral malpractices has been rising. We have a kind of a three phases. Between 2006 and 2014, we saw, you know, a little increase in these complaints, but then between 2015 and 2020, there is another phase with, you know, an important increase, but obviously the last period between 2020. 2021 and 2024 is a dramatic increase. So what happened? I mean, what is, because at the same time, there have been different electoral reforms trying to make more difficult to manipulate elections. The next one, please. Well, these show you topics we are dealing with, the types of electoral manipulation. So what we see in the purple color that we use, that from 2007, the intervention of governors is increasing. It's dramatic indeed. I mean, in 2007, 100% of electoral complaints were about governors intervening in elections. And from 2020, 21, the use of public resources, which is very close to the intervention of public officials or governors, is also increasing, and the direct intervention of governors is decreasing. That probably they are using someone else to intervene in elections through, you can see it by the use of public resources. Next one, please. As I mentioned, this is a work in progress. We are still dealing with the analysis by state by state. Mexico has 32 states. We have analyzing only 3 of them, because it means going state by state and looking at the trend. And what I wanted what we wanted to show you is how the trend can be seen in these 3 cases. The 2 of them with many complaints, 1 of them with only, a few complaints. But the trend is still very clear. The state of Mexico, this is a huge state. It has more than 20 million inhabitants. And then the second case we are showing you is Nuevo León, which is another state in the north. It is the second biggest state in Mexico, still also with lots of complaints. And probably I will tell you something about the complaints, because the kind of complaints we are dealing with is only ones that are, according to this electoral institution, the Electoral Tribunal, well-founded, with enough evidence to be analyzed. And then, I mean, the ending is something we are not dealing with. So at the end, the court can, say, well, I mean, the infractor, the one who is the case, it really, I mean, we don't have a punishment to assign, but what we are dealing with is the entrance, the complaint, and all of them are well-founded and judicially meaningful. Next one, please. Okay, institutional factors. In Mexico, the intervention of public officials is explicitly prohibited in the Constitution and the electoral law, and also the administrative responsibilities law. But this is, in a sense, something that has been happening in the last recent years. In 2007, the prohibition was incorporated in the Constitution as the duty of public officials to respect the principle of impartiality. In 2014, the electoral law incorporated this, also the violation of the principle, also in the electoral law. But no sanctions were introduced. It was only the duty to respect this principle that was introduced, but no sanctions. And they added a special article just to say that those who were responsible for applying whatever sanction it could be, it was the hierarchical superior. So it was a way of, it was ambiguous. Who is the hierarchical superior of, let's say, governors? 2019 and 2020, another reform were introduced, the current rules. What happened in the current rules is that there is a complex process, I would say, because the electoral law prohibits the violation of the principle of impartiality, but it is the electoral tribunal, the one that gave us the data, that analyzes and decides if there is an infraction. Sanctions sometimes, well, at federal level, they are in the electoral law, also in the administrative responsibilities law, but penalties are enforced by the hierarchical superior. And in the case of governors, the hierarchical superior is the local congress. So as you can see, there is a complex process, but also there is a problem with local congress, because when the governing party or the ruling party has a majority, there is probably no incentives to go after your boss and the governor. States, as I mentioned, Mexico has 32 states. States have the obligation to reform their local laws to avoid contradiction with the federal laws and the Constitution. But local congresses can decide if they introduce penalties in, let's say, the electoral law and the administrative law, as in the federal level, only in the administrative law, which is leaving, in a sense, everything, the sanctions, in the hands of an institution that is nominated, whose titular, or the one who decides, is nominated by the governor himself or herself. If the electoral bodies plays a role, which are the only ones that are independent. So as we see, I mean, even though we have all these sanctions and the law is very clean in the sense that all public officials have the duty to respect the principle of impartiality, the rules and the way in which those institutions have to decide whether or not there was an infraction and the implementation, it is a political problem. Next one, please. I'll show you here the strength of rules, the strength of sanctions we found in the three cases we show you: the state of Mexico, Nuevo León, and San Luis Potosí. And here you can, well, you can see, but it's sometimes difficult to understand just in the presentation, but you can see we have been classifying with applause the strength of sanctions. Why? Because we consider that if you have the prohibition and sanctions in the electoral law, also in the law of administrative responsibilities, and electoral bodies, which are the only ones who are independent, are involved in this process, you have, a very strong, let's say, judicial system. So you can, in a sense, you can sanction a governor who is intervening. And we have, in the case of the state of Mexico, we have that the prohibition is in the electoral law, also in the administrative law. The state electoral tribunal is involved, the local electoral body is involved, and the hierarchical superior, and the lowest judicial system is in San Luis Potosí, because it is probably, only the administrative tribunal is involved in the sanctioning process. Next one, please. In terms of our second independent variable, we have, the point of departure is that the competition can do both encourage or deter efforts, but we take the more than winning argument by Simser. And we argue that the political competition, in this case, implies considering the competitiveness of the adversary, not only the margin of victory or the closeness of the competition. That's why we argue that the selection of the manipulation strategies have to take into account the electoral or legislative strength, percentage of seats of the position and the share of seats for the governing party to reach majority. Next one, please. And well, I mean, this is just to show you that fortunately the relationship we are trying to find in these three cases takes place. In these three cases, probably less in the case of San Luis Potosí and no, I'm sorry, is Nuevo León. You see, you know, that as the share of seats that the governing party needs to reach majority increases, also do the electoral complaints. Next one, please. Yeah, preliminary findings. Well, we think that the deterioration of electoral integrity suggests a rising trend of electoral malpractices. One contribution of our work is the way in which we are using the judicial complaints as an indicator of manipulation. Complaints with substantive sentences reveal well-founded and legally well-founded cases, making it a reliable and valid indicator, we argue. And the indicators of electoral malpractices in Mexico show their rising and also diversification. And the case we are showing is the legal intervention of governor, which increased dramatically. And singular pattern regarding the legal sanctions that we found out, this is something that are intriguing us, is that when the infraction of the principle of impartiality was incorporated in the law, the complaints were increasing. So one of what we think that in a sense, probably prohibiting and sanctioning electoral malpractices may not serve to discourage their action, but it does serve to denounce them. They receive, you know, in a sense, candidates, parties, opposition parties found that if they are in the law, the obligation of legal, in this case, the obligation of public officials to obey the principle of impartiality. If it is in the law and you have the way, the way in which you can complain legally, then it is good. So that's why, you know, complaints are increasing. It's not because it doesn't happen before, but because candidates parties didn't have, you know, the legal resources to go and complain in an institution that can do something. Well, so far, no governors have been sanctioned properly, formally. They are not in jail and they are not, you know, sanctioned in any way. And the state cases that we are dealing, especially Nuevo León, Mexico, show that the share of seats to reach majority increases those illegal interventions of governors. The next one, which is the final one. Next step, well, complete the analysis for all the states in Mexico. Explore additional factors that might influence the trend of electoral malpractices, and look for methods or tools that help us to find significant relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irma.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom.
And so next up, we'll take Kenneth. And then after that, apologies for my late arrival. After that, we'll take the discussant and then Q&As. Okay, so Kenneth, do you want to go ahead and begin?
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Kenneth Chen. I'm based in Hong Kong with Hong Kong Baptist University. Thanks so much for having this conference and thanks for having me. Special thanks to all the co-chairs, Toby, Holly, and Gabriela, and thanks Tom being the panel chair, and later on, of course, I'd thank in advance Bernard for acting as the discussants. This is the work in progress, and putting a lot of work with my colleagues and basically displaying the way we approach the issue and how we are trying to analyze it from various perspectives. The focus is on the pandemic elections that took place between 2020 and 2023 across 2 continents, namely Asia and Europe, and looking into 2 aspects which have been quite, debatable among colleagues and practitioners as well. One is the so-called autocratic advantage thesis, namely not only that countries like China, for example, taking the lead here to show that autocracies outperformed democracies in terms of pandemic control, in terms of political stability, but also by extension, a bit of informational autocracy is happening there, meaning propaganda-wise, trying to promote autocracy or authoritarian practices, diffusing them to different parts of the world. A related thesis is called the incumbency advantage. You might be easily translated, that can be easily translated into the rally around the flag effect. That's been quite widely debated. Usually when countries are at war with one another, we might say that the incumbents will stand to gain from popularity or in terms of diffused trust and so on, and pandemic being portrayed or framed as not only as a public health crisis, but maybe some sort of threat or even war that might have benefited the incumbents irrespective of regime type. So these are the 2 theses that we've been, looking into to set the stage for the discussion, most specifically based in Hong Kong and with a lot of debates about democracy versus autocracy. Naturally, we do wish to ask to what extent COVID-19 as a pandemic affected the electoral fortunes of autocrats and democrats, and factors affecting electoral integrity and trust, and last but not least, regime resilience and fragility. We've been gathering data, existing data sets, very useful ones from basically all available sources. And we try to come with some comparative work, and it's still a work in progress. At this moment, we're presenting data from Europe and Asia, but we do have that ambition to expand it a little bit further to other parts of the world and regions as well. So comments are welcome. So this is basically just what I've just said as the introductory remark concerning autocracy advantage times, or together interacting with incumbency advantage, portraying autocracies as a stronger model of a pandemic governance. Now, in case, of course, when autocrats did not deliver, as well as the propaganda sounded, they would, of course, resort to all sorts of tricks, including electoral manipulation, polarization, misinformation, co-opting civil society organizations, and trying to divide and conquer the opposition, and so on. So it seems to me that on the face of it, autocracies stood to gain from the pandemic a lot more than what the democratic leaders could have possibly done, because of inherent regime and institutional and maybe historical cultural factors as well. Still, we would be interested in to what extent COVID-19 did become eventually a quiet assassin of democracy in terms of promoting not just polarization, but also giving authoritarians or illiberal Democrats a free ride to expand power and to further drive the regimes from functioning democracies to some sort of hybrid, and deconsolidating the regime as democratic institutions and causing backsliding and so on. Now, I think on face of it, there were sometimes apparently alarming evidence coming from public opinion surveys. You can track the ebbs and flows of public opinion with respect to whether or not they find democracy being the best system of governance, or they would consider options such as this one being shown across Asia. There were quite a lot of people in Indonesia, for example, saying that they would not mind having fewer freedoms if it made the government more efficient, or they would strongly agree or disagree, strongly agree or agree that authoritarian governments were more effective than democratic governments when it comes to managing the pandemics. Across Europe as well, the situation apparently a little better in our nation as cases, but still there were legit concerns concerning the prospects of the democratic countries or struggling democracies over there. So very briefly, we look into the data and started to think exactly how pushbacks might take place in terms of engaging this situation, this pandemic situation, and to maybe resist backsliding or efforts to try to sort of drive democracies towards autocracies. And naturally, we look into CSO, civil society organizations. This is one of the aspects which we consider not very well looked into in the extent literature at this stage. And therefore, we try to gather information qualitatively as much as quantitatively to see to what extent the opportunity structure amid COVID-19 hardly became so unfavorable to mobilization, protests, social movements, civil society work, and so on. But at the same time, we see contradicting evidence showing that the pandemic actually opened up new civic space, new opportunities, even for some of those most oppressive systems in Asia, across Asia, whereby CSOs who otherwise could not do much advocacy would turn to service delivery, would try to sort of make use of the public health crisis to promote their norms and values and standards with respect to safe, fair elections, for example. We look at the Civic Space Monitor. Of course, it's expert space judgment scores, but basically by and large, it gives you an impression about the Asian country's situation across the board. Europe, apologies, a bit small print here, basically quite green, so very open, or rather just a little bit restrictive civic space, whereby the opportunity structures would differ quite considerably from those we have just seen across Asia. Now, at some point, me and my colleagues debated whether or not during the pandemic it was possible to organize, arrange any protests. Definitely not for the case of Hong Kong, which unfortunately has undergone really rapid autocratization over the past few years, where legally speaking, protests, demonstrations were not outlawed, but it's politically impossible to organize or to come out to protest against the government. However, interestingly, we made use of the ACLA data set to see 12 months preceding the polling day, the events being organized or being recorded, reported between these 5 categories of civic space as described by the Civic Space Monitor of Civicus, from closed all the way down to open. Of course, we are not only just counted the raw number, but also try to sort of factor in the size of the population. So you also have the events per million on the other side of the table. And we also try to sort of cross-tab it with the Freedom House, famous, everybody will know it, free, partly free, and not free regimes to show the patterns. In other words, even during the pandemic, even during the lockdown, even during all the restrictions, we did see free regimes being more accommodating to pre-election and pre-polling day events in terms of protests and so on. Partly free regions being next, of course, not free regions and regimes would remain pretty much very restrictive. Having said that, even across Asia, of course, you still remember what happened back in 2022, when across China, even being cherished even by the World Health Organization as the role model of how to manage the pandemic, young and sick and tired urban dwellers and students decided to stage the white paper movement, and that effectively ended the lockdown, the so-called zero tolerance regime imposed by the Xi government. So therefore, we may sort of curious and find it very intriguing to see to what extent civil society organizations matter in terms of resisting democratic backsliding, and also try to promote further democratization or re-democratization. This is the situation in Asia. And next is the slide showing you the findings across Europe. So free, partly free, and partly free regimes obviously witness the more actions organized by civil society organizations, protesters. So most of these actions, as you can see, as I can see, reading through the ACLA data set, were basically more than 90% peaceful, nonviolent protests and demonstrations. Now, what's interesting here from data coming from Asia is this: the red line shows here health-related issues. So as I said, as alluded to, CSOs, social movements decide to took advantage of the pandemic to vent the grievances of the people, or to have articulate grievances across the board. And therefore, before elections, there were more events focusing on health policy issues and implementation of COVID-19 measures, more than electoral issues, all the way up to, beyond 2022, when the situation died down quite a bit, thanks to the introduction of the universal vaccination program. As we gathered, there were more electoral issues overtaking health-related issues when it came to organizing public protests and movements across Asia between 2020 and 2023. Whereas when you look at Europe, the situation is more vivid, perhaps due to the fact that election-related issues were sort of well-versed or well-practiced. So during the pandemic period, there were far more health-related issues being used to rally, to articulate, to mobilize, to show people's disagreements with existing government policies. So pushbacks. We do therefore see that in spite of the COVID-19 measures, the restrictions, and so on and so forth across the board, with just a few exceptions. Some of those cases we look at, only 2 did not have any event being recorded by ECLA. All the other places or countries under investigation did. The CSO, civil society organization, did practice well in terms of norm entrepreneurship, resisting the lockdown measures and articulating pro-democracy norms, liberal values, and so on, overcoming fear and hopelessness at the same time, without succumbing to the so-called China model or the authoritarian model for handling the pandemic. They did a lot in terms of educating the public about alternative models, for example, those coming from Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea, where they could really strike a balance between liberal values or civil freedoms, as well as protection of public health during the pandemic as well. So in terms of qualitative analysis, we did have a lot of interesting stories to share as well, but not maybe for reasons of time in this particular presentation. Now, we do look at the factors accounting for electoral integrity in pandemic elections. Now, not surprisingly, regime types matter a lot, together with state capacity as measured by the level of state fragility during the same period of time under examination. We did study pandemic response measures that were said to have undermined or weakened electoral integrity. Just imagine when voters could not go to vote, or voters who have been unfortunately sick with COVID would not be able to exercise their rights, and so on. Other lockdown measures that might have also undermined the campaigns. So all these measures, of course, would be taken into consideration. Electoral management capacity, as well as civil society. So these factors are the candidates that we would like to look into for a more general regression analysis. As factors, the regime types do matter, contributing positively, and also positively to electoral integrity. This means regime type moving over there because autocracies undermined electoral integrity, obviously, versus democracies. And then state fragility index, more fragile states are less, will be weaker in terms of electoral integrity. COVID measures, interestingly, the vaccines did contribute quite positively as soon as the universal vaccination program started to roll out. Then people felt more comfortable in terms of electoral integrity. It did improve as measured by PI. We used the 8th version of the perceptions of electoral integrity index for these particular analysis. State of emergency index is the one being the measure with the VDAM data, varieties of democracy data, showing how regimes make use of state of emergency to introduce or impose the lockdown measures, and relating, I would say, politically motivated measures against the opposition and so on. EMP capacity, positively contributing to electoral integrity, plus 3 other civil society related indices collected together from VDAM data as well, including the degree of consultation with CSOs by the state or the policymakers, less repression, not more, but it's reverse coded. That's why it's like that. But my apologies for not doing the better touch work there. Less repression, of course, will enhance electoral integrity. And last but not least, smaller number of CSOs in civil society also promoting diversity, perhaps, and promoting electoral integrity as a result. So we're trying to look into to what extent civil society interacting with electoral integrity would, produce a better defense for democracy as a result. we look into electoral turnout across those elections that happened. There were more than 180 elections that happened during the pandemic period, where when we look at turnover, we not only look at the executive branch, but also to what extent parliamentary elections may have impact on the executive branch's legitimacy as well. If the executive branch has lost control over one or both chambers of the parliament. So a lot of judgment call would be needed. In terms of turnover, you can see that the average number of a percentage of elections lost in autocracies and democracies respectively, and of course across the two continents under investigation. Not very surprising, I would say, when it comes to turnover. A lot of people would still say that among autocracies, turnovers are always rare. And also between Asia and Europe, where Europe, of course, still has a larger number of democracies than regimes in Asia, you will see also high degree of turnover in general terms. We divided the regimes into 4 categories, from liberal democracy through electoral democracy to electoral autocracy and closed autocracy, to show you the pattern very briefly. In total and across Asia, and then of course across Europe too. So the pandemic did have an impact on the electoral fortunes of the incumbents. We look into bivariant analysis now, very briefly, for reasons of time, to what factors impact on electoral turnover. We use the Mann-Whitley U test. It's sort of a t-test, but we're dealing with non-random data here when it comes to electoral turnover. So it's just a very simple, straightforward looking at the differences of summation of means or mean rank between cases with turnover and cases without turnover. PEI indexes, some of them, fair electoral laws plus incumbent not favored by laws, did have an impact. More likely to generate turnover, let me put it that way. Among VDM data concerning Asian cases, balanced civil society participation index, and diverse civil society organizations did also have a positive impact or influence association with high likelihoods of turnover. Across Europe, more indicators being found associated or with a little bit more statistical significance using the Mann-Whitley U test. Quite a lot of them, again, concerning electoral integrity, the regime, the fairness, the competitiveness, the level of participation, less barriers to political parties and opposition party autonomy, of course, will contribute more to a high degree of electoral integrity, and turning to civil society organizations as well. And plus, in case of Europe, interestingly, ACLED data related to elections, pre-election per million, also contributed to a higher likelihood of electoral turnover. Electoral turnover, as designed in this particular work we did together with my colleagues, now is portrayed as a dichotomous variable. Therefore, we used the logistic regression model to try to take a look at the situation. And we do notice that there was a slight support for the so-called rally effect. So when a number of cases before one, that's the variable we look at. When the number of infection cases grew before the elections, 2 weeks before elections, incumbents stood a better chance of retaining power. Whereas the vaccination program, as mentioned, did contribute to turnover. Plus the ACLED events also contributed. Civil society indicator, anti-regime movements and less civil society repression also contributed to electoral turnover better. So this is the chart showing the tendencies, the 95% confidence intervals for all predictors. Now, last part of it, and then I'm going to stop soon. Electoral turnover is one thing. Democratization versus autocratization, of course, is a very different matter. So, I'm just doing some simple basic tallying. The draft I sent earlier to this conference that's got some mistakes here. So my apologies. For example, here, regimes or countries that experienced turnover appear to be more are likely to resist democratic backsliding than regimes, among democracies, than regimes without. Among autocracies, sadly, there's no way we can turn the clock back. Simply when autocratization had already gone underway before the pandemic, there's no chance. We didn't have the evidence, put it that way, that we witnessed the reversal, in spite of all the efforts or goodwills put together. So democracy has long been an exception in Asia. And of the countries under investigation, we have seen not very hopeful signs about democratization or re-democratization. But across Europe, we got better news in terms of resisting democratic backsliding. Now, in some 35 regimes of the 35 under investigation ruled elections that took place in these regimes, nations take into consideration, they remained unchanged. This is the last chart showing the changing number of regime types across both Europe and Asia over the pandemic period between 2020 and 2023. So this is not to say that everything's fine, cool, don't worry, business as usual, democracy survived the pandemic, it would last for happily ever after. This is not to give you give anyone any false hope, but it means simply throughout this whole research, taking into consideration particularly the roles of civil society, social movements, protests, and so on and so forth, to give us some hope that there were ways and means whereby, bottom-up approach, mobilization of people who cared enough about democracy might be providing the last line of defense, especially when autocratization hasn't started or not gone underway yet. So this is important, and therefore the moral perhaps of all these coming together is we need to look beyond the elites or the small circle of governing elites plus maybe the opposites. We need to look beyond the corridors of power and bring back civil society and civil society organizations and activities back in. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thanks for listening. That will be it.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth.
I'm trying to stop sharing this.
So at this time, we'll next up we'll have Bernard Tamas from Valdosta State to give some discussants comments on both papers. And after that, we'll have a moment for Irma and Kenneth to react if they'd like, and then we'll gather questions from the audience. So Bernard, you're up next.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to read these papers and to comment on them. I learned a lot. I think this is an area where this is a little bit outside of my strengths, but that's always a good thing. I don't know a great deal about Mexican politics. I've reviewed other papers, read where I can, but it's not a country I've studied. And Kenneth's paper is very interesting. But again, hopefully that makes the comments maybe give some help there, I hope. What I'll say just as a quick summary about both of these papers is it's very clear that both sets of authors are very much in the thickets on this. These are all both deeply researched papers already. These are not initial runs. Both authors have done a great deal of work. To some degree, I think they're still in the thickets on it, but that's a big part of the process. So I'm going to start with Irma's paper on electoral manipulation, and in Mexico, and just to summarize again, which she did very well, but I'll do it anyway. The theory on it is that, and I'm sorry if I get any of the detail wrong, but basically it's looking at two different potential factors and when do government figures intervene or try to manipulate elections and election results. And one of them is it's the level of legitimacy. In other words, if if it's very illegitimate, considered very illegitimate for government officials to intervene, they're less likely to do so. And the other one is a combination of trying to win seats and also gain some form of political strength. So this is where we're starting. The paper has a great overview of the debate, which was a lot very good for me. It went through a lot of this in detail, and um, I'll say what I see is let me start with this, and before I start throwing up some questions. So it was a great overview, and a great overview of the change in manipulations. The chart, which at least in the presentation was on figure 1, the rise of manipulations since, okay, I don't have it down, but I know it came since 2002 over to 2025. This was very, very effective, and this was really seemed to set the stage well. My one question on this, it's a small one, but an important one, I think, is that the numbers suddenly drop in 2025. And my first thought is the reason they drop is because we are still in 2025. And therefore it's a data issue. And that might be something worth taking a look back at or trying to explain, because what it seems like is the real story is this giant rise. So here you have what we're seeing with the authors, and you're saying you're still collecting data, but it also, the paper demonstrates, a substantial amount of knowledge and understanding of what's going on. That also was reflected in your presentation. And I think you probably agree with the statement, and I'll make it though anyway, that the issue seems to be, though, still connecting the questions to the data, as in the analysis. The analysis on the change is substantial and it's clear. And by the way, I think, and in the way it was in the paper, I actually for a while thought that there wasn't going to be a connection until I got to the section at the very end where you actually did make the connection, which was a very good presentation of an argument for what was going on. At least that was my reaction to it. And so this comes back to my authors, scholars in the middle of the thickets. I'm saying, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, here is what to me looks like a solid explanation of what was going on, a history, but it's not driving the paper. What's driving the paper has been this deep analysis of the changes going on in Mexico. And that analysis, of course, is really important. It's especially more important for you to know than for us as a reader. But that is kind of where I've seen it. Now, I'm going to just give a couple more. I have lots of notes on it, but I'm trying to remember which ones I'm looking at. Oh, yes. You had a figure 2, and I'm hoping this will be helpful. Figure 2, you had the percents of change of types of interventions, right? And it looked like it was, if you go back a few years, it was the percent of government interventions were very high. I'm sorry, I'm going to get the details a little bit wrong, but governor interventions. But then by the end, it was violence against candidates that started rising. But here's what I'm not sure about when I'm reading the chart, looking at the graph, is since there presents, I don't know if this means that the governors are intervening less, or just the numbers have completely shot up, and that shooting up has been a big rise of violence. In other words, you can't tell with the way that it's presented what exactly is the change. You can't, and that is kind of an important, and it's an easy fix, by the way. This is not a major issue but it makes it harder for those of us trying to interpret it. And I think I'm just gonna, without going into too much detail, I don't want to bore everybody with that, but what I've noticed, and I definitely appreciate, as we get into table 3, We had the long table, it was a figure three, the electoral complaints by states. I appreciate the knowledge, but I couldn't follow it. And I think that the regulation by states, I'd really wonder if, I mean, this is really great material for an appendix, maybe is the way to put it. It's for people who want to go back and take a look and kind of focus in on your story more. The story is there. I think you're farther along than you may think, is basically what and by the way, again, I have not done research on electoral manipulation. I cannot waltz in as well. Let me tell you about I haven't done any. But I really like where you're going with this. And this is, but again, I think I'm going to stick back to my theme on this, which is you're clearly in the thickets of it, but I think you're farther along than you might think. You might want to find a way of doing the analysis and wrap it up and get it out, and instead of worrying too much. So that would be I guess I'll do both, Tom, at the same, just doing both, and then okay. Kenneth's paper, which on the pandemic, which is a topic I found very, very interesting. And again, there is a great deal of work completed here. There's a lot in this analysis, and I like the fact that there's basically a combination of two things. We're talking about what is a general concept of regime stability. I'm going to say it that way for now, but I'm going to have a question about that. Between autocratic, you refer to it as the autocratic advantage, or the incumbency effect in democracies. The rally around the flag was another version of it. And so the analysis is about which ones, there's a lot here. And so my understanding of it was it's a question of which of these two are more resilient or in a moment of a crisis. And the idea is, well, the problem with the advantage for the autocrats, for an authoritarian regime, is that they can use a pandemic as an excuse to crack down more. And I think you even gave the Hungary example, which is one I remember also. It's like, there's a pandemic, better give me some more power to handle it. And then, which I have no intention of giving back, which was the implication. Whereas in a democracy, it becomes, after 6 months of a lockdown, people start getting more and more upset, and then they start questioning the ruling party, might even be questioning the form of government. So, but one of the things, and again, this is I'm going to stick to this concept because I think this is true for both. You deep in the thickets. I almost look at this paper and I'm wondering, do you want to divide it into two papers? Because you've already got a great deal of work done here, and we're jumping around on a couple of very related, but nonetheless potentially distinctive issues. But still, the first question I have to ask is when you're talking about incumbency effect, incumbency advantage, when we're talking democracies, are we talking about the ruling party losing power, or are we talking about democratic backsliding? These are two completely different questions, and obviously the backsliding is the more important one. You kind of touched more in the presentation on at the end that backsliding, but that kind of is one of them. I don't know if you even have an answer to it on that one, but whether you do or not, I think it's a question that I had in my mind. And the second one that really, dogged me a lot, and it's not it's one of those, okay, somehow I think this should be addressed. So we were talking about electoral turnover, and you gave as the starting statistics, the turnover was 55% in democracies and 15% for autocracies, right? So much higher during the pandemic for the democracies that you studied. And what I couldn't help but wonder is compared to what? And what I mean by that is I look at autocracies and I say, well, of course they're going to turn over less because they're autocracies. That's what they're good at. Or if they're ones that survive, they're good at that. And so therefore I'm almost more interested in knowing, you know, did the turnovers for democracies increase? And did they increase for the autocracies more? Because I mean, I don't want to go into the whole Bayesian thing. We don't need to go to that direction, but at least conceptually we kind of do. We have to have kind of a baseline to compare this against. And if you add the baseline, a lot of the other stuff, I think, to me at least, starts falling into place. I mean, you had shown, I don't remember it from the paper, a really great graph about the I think it was, I even redrew it as you were writing. It was the increase in terms of CSO events. I guess there were people protests was the idea, and so you have the rise in 2022 and then a drop again. So this is a great chart. But I still ask the question, okay, but what was it like? Because 2020, the pandemic already started. Now, it might be it took a year or so before people started getting really aggravated and started protesting. But if you go back a few years, you wipe out the question of, is it that? That's kind of where what I'm, looking for. So it's a little bit of add-on. I really love the stuff on the civil society. The chart you showed based on, I don't remember if the chart was from the linear or logistic regression, but it was whichever, which was showing the confidence intervals. Love that a lot because I found all of it very interesting, but I almost found it as two separate issues, which is, two different papers almost, not similar, but not identical. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff. And the last thing, you didn't really put in the regression, and I'm sorry if this bores people, but just do give me a minute on this. So I'm reading through the regression and I had all kinds of thoughts about it. And I guess I could summarize them as three things. The one was your R square was through the ceiling, was something like 0.85 or something. Incredibly high correlation with the with between the dependent variable and maybe one of the independent variables. And so I'm wondering, I'm not going to say, okay, that's a problem, but I would at least want an explanation as to what's going on. Because it could be what you were doing was you were setting it up so that you were eliminating, other factors. You were wiping out the possibility of spuriousness. But I would hope you would be clear because I'm asking the question. I don't have an answer. Another thing, as the second one was often it seemed like if you look at your charts, it almost, it was not always clear to me what the main story was. The quantity of interest. What's the key variable? Put it on top, mark it off, something, right? Make it clear. And really and also, your tables have stuff that really looks like it came straight out of VDEM, as in the names of the variables. And I use VDEM, but I don't remember the names. So, okay, this is it. Like I said, this was really great reading both of these papers. And I have, high hopes on both of them. I think both of them are well on their way to becoming, not only publishable, but something of significance. So congratulations to you both. And I hope whatever I said was, what I've said was helpful. So, okay, I'll hand it back to Tom.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Bernard.